A letter started in a young boy's mind, addressed to the father he barely knew. It said that, to keep things short, he just didn't get it. He sat at a huge table piled high with food, a whole roasted chicken in front of him, but he just wondered why he was even there. A gloved hand offered him a bowl of stew, telling him to hurry up and eat. But the boy could only think, why? Around the long table sat all sorts of strange creatures. One, with a dark robe and a sharp, beak-like mask, commented that with such a skinny body, he wasn't even a proper sacrifice. The boy sat at the head of the table, a tall, hooded figure standing behind him like a silent guard. Surrounded by cat people and beings in armor, the boy wondered again how things ended up like this. The answer began not too long ago. A veteran game designer named Jin Toru stood before his boss, holding his letter of resignation. His boss told him he seemed very determined, and Jin quietly agreed. The boss took the letter, wished him well in the future, and noted what a shame it was to lose him. As Jin walked out of the office, he felt a strange sense of relief. He thought that he wouldn't be holding anyone back anymore. The company had gotten so big, and compared to everyone else, he felt like he was just dead weight. He passed by the desk of a recent graduate, a young woman named Sakurai. She was groaning in frustration, wondering why things were going so wrong with her work. She stared at her computer screen, where a 3D model of a monster looked completely different from the detailed drawing next to it. She complained to herself that while she could create human models just fine, monsters were just too hard. Jin paused behind her. He looked at her screen and told her it would be better to just redo the model from the start. Sakurai looked up, startled. Jin repeated his advice, telling her to just redo it. He quickly apologized, seeing her expression, and tried to explain. He said it wasn't that her work was bad, but that it would be faster to start over from scratch than to try and fix what she had. He asked if she had started the head with a sphere, and she timidly confirmed she had. He explained that for modeling heads, it was important to use the right starting shapes, like a cylinder or a cube, depending on the structure. He told her that in 3D modeling, the first move was everything. You had to perfectly understand the subject's structure, or you'd waste precious time and it would be rude to the character itself. Sakurai listened, and then timidly called his name. Wanting to show her, Jin reached over and put his hand on hers to guide the mouse. Sakurai froze and whispered about his hand. Jin instantly panicked, pulling back and waving his hands defensively. He swore he didn't mean anything by it and was just trying to give advice. He thought she was going to sue him and ran away in terror, shouting for her not to. Sakurai stood up, completely bewildered, and called after him. Jin stopped near the door, clenching his fist, wondering what on earth he was even doing. Later, in the company cafeteria, Sakurai thought to herself what a modest person he was. She was talking to a friend, a planner from another department, who thought his behavior was just plain weird. The planner pointed out that it wasn't just any designer, it was that Jin. When Sakurai asked who she meant, she launched into a passionate explanation. She described how Jin was a general designer who could do everything, not just 3D but 2D effects, animation, and more. Her friend wasn't impressed. She admitted that while Jin was amazing from a designer's point of view, she wondered if the company really needed a generalist like him anymore. She explained that the company didn't make games from scratch these days. They mostly hired other companies to do the heavy lifting. There were plenty of specialists who could do character models. Besides, she added, Jin seemed gloomy, unkempt, and didn't talk much outside of work. She figured the higher-ups probably didn't like him very much. Sakurai tried to argue, but her friend cut her off. Sakurai felt a wave of sadness. She truly believed Jin was an amazing person. She had even dreamed of being acknowledged by him one day. Her friend then delivered the final blow, telling her that it didn't matter anymore. It seemed Jin was leaving the company soon. And not just the company, but the entire gaming industry. Hearing this, Sakurai jumped to her feet and ran out of the cafeteria, while her friend shouted for her to wait. Jin was on the building's rooftop, his usual break spot. He used to believe that giving your all to your work was the most important thing. But now, he felt like no one was asking that from him anymore. Suddenly, the door to the roof burst open and Sakurai appeared. She said she knew he'd be up there. Jin's first thought was that she had come to file a lawsuit, and he recoiled in fear. She quickly told him that wasn't why she was there and asked if it was true he was quitting. He admitted it was. He figured she must have heard the rumors. Sakurai asked him why. Jin explained that he'd been in the game industry for about 15 years. Back then he thought he'd be a designer until the very end. But now, the industry preferred everyone to do the same kind of specialized work, and he realized he probably wasn't needed anymore. He recalled a reckless project from long ago, where many people had quit and he ended up doing almost all the design work himself. Sakurai cut him off, shouting that she knew about it. She knew the game he was talking about, Rune Fantasia. She explained that its charm was the world full of both humans and demi-humans, who had to come together to defeat a demon king. Jean was surprised she knew such an unpopular game, but she told him she had played it multiple times. She confessed that she loved that game during her childhood. Even though it was a fictional world, the characters felt so alive, as if they were real people. When she saw the staff credits, she was shocked to see that one person, Toru Jean, was responsible for so much of it: the 2D effects, the animation, the 3D modeling. She told him, her voice thick with emotion, that she came into the industry because she admired him. Tears streamed down her face as she cried out that she still wanted to learn so much more from him. She called him a god. Confused, Jean questioned her. She insisted she wasn't mistaken. For the world that she loved so much, he was its god. Her words struck him. He looked away, muttering, "Oh, brother." He apologized to her, admitting he had no right to say things like, "I'm no longer needed." He smiled faintly, saying that he supposed even he had something he could do for the future. He decided he would have to take back his resignation letter. As he turned to leave, Sakurai called out his name, her voice filled with hope. At that moment, something flew through the air and hit Jean square on the back of the head with a loud thud. Sakurai gasped in shock. A crow, startled by the commotion, flapped its wings overhead. But the crow wasn't empty-beaked. It had been carrying a tortoise, which it dropped in its surprise. The tortoise landed right on Jin's head. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious, as Sakurai frantically called for an ambulance. Jin's last fading thought was a bizarre one. Was the crow aiming for him? Then he remembered something else. It was a flashback to his youth. His drunk father was telling him a story from ancient Rome, or maybe Greece. It was about an incredibly cautious man who avoided every possible danger. But one day, an eagle dropped a tortoise on his head, and the cautious man died. His father had laughed, saying the moral was that even if you live a safe life, when it's time to die, you die. So, his father concluded, people should just live however they want. An unseen voice roared that no parent would teach their kid something like that. Suddenly, Jean found himself in a forest. He looked up at a night sky with 2 moons. He wondered where he was. One moment he was on the roof, the next he was here. His stomach growled with hunger, and he saw a huge, strange tower in the distance. He felt thirsty and knelt by a river to get a drink. But when he looked at his reflection in the water, it wasn't his face staring back. It was a small child with white hair and big blue eyes. He screamed in shock, realizing he had become a child. Panicking, he thought he must have been reincarnated into another world. Before he could process it, 2 figures with dog-like faces appeared, carrying a torch. They called themselves kobolds. They saw him and shouted that a human was there, thinking they were under attack. Then they realized it was just one small child and lunged to capture him. The child, Thing, cried out in terror. Just as their claws were about to grab him, everything froze. The kobolds were stuck in place, paused. He had no idea what happened, but he knew he had to run. He scrambled to his feet and dashed away. The pause didn't last long. Soon, the kobolds were gasping and coughing, wondering what kind of magic that was. More creatures began to appear from the shadows of the forest. Were tigers, halflings, and even elves with beast-like ears and strange face tattoos. He recognized them all. They were just like the races he had designed for Rune Fantasia. He even noticed a small detail, a hole in the kobolds' pants for their tails, a setting he had fought for long ago. He remembered arguing with his boss that elves didn't have to be stereotypically beautiful, that giving them unique tattoos would give them character. He had insisted that if he didn't go that far, he couldn't call what he created a world. He looked up and saw the tall, slender tower again. He recognized it instantly. It was the last dungeon from his game. Just then, a huge, armored dragon man, a dragoon, grabbed him from behind, lifting him into the air. The dragoon proudly announced that he had caught the human brat. He told the others that this offering would be pleasing to their god. Confused, the boy asked where they were going. The dragoon sneered, saying that as a human, he should know of the humiliation the demi-humans had suffered after the world became peaceful. They brought him to a clearing where a large stone monument stood, topped with a winged statue. A priest in dark robes, with horns peeking from his hood, stood before it. The creatures threw the boy forward as a sacrifice. The priest raised his hands and declared they had brought this human for their divine creator. The boy looked at the strange symbols carved into the monument. He could read them perfectly. He knew what they said because he was the one who had designed them. The priest's voice boomed, offering the sacrifice to their divine creator, Torujin. His mind was a jumble of fragmented memories. He remembered being a game designer named Jin Toru, a man in his 30s who had been in the industry for years. He remembered the rooftop and Sakurai-san's tearful confession that he was the god of her favorite world, Rune Fantasia. Then came the ridiculous series of events, the coffee can, the tortoise, and the sudden arrival in this new place. He was now a small child, a sacrifice meant for the creator god, himself. It all felt like a broken game, a glitch in reality, and he couldn't figure out why he was even here. Back in the forest clearing, the dragoon crossed his massive arms, looking down at the small boy with confusion. He asked how they should prepare the offering. Jin's blood ran cold. He imagined all the terrible ways it could be done. A heart torn out, blood collected in a bottle. The thoughts were so horrifying he nearly screamed. He remembered what the creatures had said when they first captured him. They believed that sacrificing a human would change the world. He timidly asked the priest if he was mistaken about that. The horned priest stood before the stone monument, his face hidden in shadow. He simply said that the boy was indeed mistaken. Jin panicked. He couldn't understand. Why was it such a crime for a human to be here? What had his kind done to become so deeply hated? A faint memory surfaced of him breaking up a fight at his old company, how risky it felt to step in when people were angry, but how he felt it was better than letting things get worse. The massive dragoon seemed to take pity on the boy's ignorance. He grumbled that it was pitiful that humans didn't even teach their children what they had done. He promised the boy he would tell him everything, and that he should listen carefully. The world, the dragoon explained, was shaped by powerful special characters called runes. They were used for everything from lighting street lamps to making weapons stronger on the battlefield. Ji knew this, of course. It was the core magic system he had designed. But the dragoon's story took a dark turn. He spoke of a time when a demon king appeared, reviving ancient, forbidden runes and throwing the world into chaos. To stop him, a human hero set out on a journey to defeat the demon king. As Jin listened, a chilling realization washed over him. The dragoon wasn't just telling him a story, he was reciting the entire plot of Rune Fantasia. The main quest of his game had already been completed. The world was supposed to be at peace. The dragoon confirmed it. The demon king was defeated 10 years ago. But that, he said, was not the end of the story. The hero returned to his country to help remove the lingering curses left behind by the demon lord. When the hero arrived, the human king praised him for his victory. But the king then declared that since a human had saved the world now belonged to humans. What followed was a nightmare Jin had never written. The humans took the forbidden curses the demon king had used and turned them on the demi-humans. They were hunted, their lands were stolen, and many were tortured and killed. Some species were wiped out completely. The dragoon looked down at the boy, his voice low and filled with pain. He asked if the child now understood why humans were hated. Jin was speechless. Such a thing was never supposed to happen. In his game, the hero worked together with the other races, overcoming their differences. The story was supposed to have a happy ending. Hearing those words, the dragoon exploded with rage. He roared about a happy ending and asked if this sounded like a happy ending to him. He snatched Jin off the ground, his powerful grip tightening around the boy's small body. He snarled that the boy should be dead, and that their god would surely understand their desperation and accept the offering. As the air was squeezed from his lungs, Jin's mind raced. He felt a strange anger rising within him, not just fear. He remembered the notes he'd scribbled down late at night, exhausted after 3 days without sleep. He recalled his design philosophy for the dragoon race. They were a proud people with strong feelings, who lived secluded lives and watched over the world. They were noble. Killing a child wasn't in their nature. It wasn't what he had made them to be. With a surge of desperate strength, Jin pushed against the scaly arm holding him. He shouted for the dragoon to stop, telling him not to let anger make him lose sight of his pride. He yelled that dragoons were a proud race, and if he killed a helpless child, his very soul would become rotten. He screamed that he, their creator, would never forgive him. The dragoon froze, his eyes wide. He seemed genuinely shocked by the boy's words. He shouted back, asking what the child could possibly know about his people. Jin just insisted that the dragoon shouldn't be this way, that he was seriously thinking about the kind of life he wanted his creations to live. In that tense moment, something whizzed through the air. An arrow, glowing with magical runes, flew straight towards Jin. Without a second thought, the dragoon twisted his body, shielding the boy and taking the enchanted arrow in his side with a grunt of pain. He dropped Jean, who fell to the ground with a yelp. The dragoon snapped the arrow shaft, glaring into the trees. He growled the name of the attacker, Riesling. An elf girl with a bow emerged from the shadows. She told the dragoon that she agreed with the child, and that he shouldn't let anger control him. Before the argument could continue, the horned priest spoke, his voice cutting through the tension. He reminded them that no matter what, the child was still a sacrifice. He then posed a strange question, asking if their creator would be happy with an offering in such a poor state. Jean stared at him, completely bewildered. A strange, uneasy feeling he'd had since arriving finally clicked into place. He remembered the detailed settings for every race in his world, but as he looked at the priest, he realized with a jolt of pure terror that he had no memory of ever creating this person. The priest knelt before the boy, a gesture that sent a shiver down Jin's spine. He told Jean that he had been waiting for him for 10 years. The other demi-humans watched from a distance, unable to hear what was being said. Then, the priest placed his hands on Jin's shoulders and lifted him up, presenting him to the crowd. He announced that while the child was too small to be a proper tribute now, he would be raised in their village until he was big enough. The dragoon, whose name was apparently Balder, shouted in protest, but the elf Riesling seemed to consider it. She noted that while the priest was hard to understand, they were all grateful to him. The priest calmly declared that he saw no objections. And so, the scene shifted back to the grand feast. The priest explained his plan. They would hold a buffet with the chieftains to deepen their unity while the offering grew. All the leaders were there. A cheerful dogman laughed it off. Balder the dragoon still looked angry, threatening to snap the kid's neck if he misbehaved. A were-tiger chieftain wanted nothing to do with him. The elf, Riesling, understood the priest's true meaning. He wanted every clan to protect the human child together. The priest then made a final declaration, ordering everyone present to never harm the human. The memory of how this all started flashed in Jin's mind. When the priest had first asked his name, he had shouted back defiantly that he was Toru. The name of their creator, spoken from the mouth of a human child, had sent waves of shock through the crowd. Backed into a corner, with nothing left to lose, he had simply leaned into the absurdity and introduced himself. He was God Toru of Rune Fantasia. Now, sitting at the head of the table, he looked at the faces of his creations. Every single one of them, characters born from his own mind, seemed to hate him for crimes he never wrote into their story. And watching over him was a mysterious priest whose origins were a complete blank, a bug in the system of his own world. Before Jean could process the terrifying implication, the priest rose, his duty seemingly done. He announced that the offering required cleansing and that he would leave it in the care of another. That other turned out to be Riesling. The elf chieftain appeared at the door to the hut a short while later, her expression a mask of pure frustration. With a sharp gesture, she led Jean to a rustic bathhouse, the air inside thick with steam from a large wooden tub. Riesling then motioned for him to get into the steaming tub with her. It was bath time. Jin's mind reeled. He thought her request was completely unreasonable. His memory flashed back to the chieftain's meeting an hour earlier. While Jean sat quietly eating the food given to him, the horned priest had brought up the subject of cleaning the offering. Balder had agreed, stating that a dirty sacrifice was unsuitable. Others murmured in agreement, the dogman chieftain and a small kobold both commenting on how filthy the human child was. Jean remembered how much their words had stung. Riesling had then posed the obvious question. Who among them was willing to touch a human to wash him? The priest, unfazed, had produced a bundle of plants and proposed a lottery. The one who pulled the plant with the roots still attached would be responsible. As the chieftains grumbled, Jean watched, feeling completely ignored as they decided his fate. It was in that moment, chewing on a piece of dried meat, that he had made a decision. He was going to get out of there. The world was clearly different from the game he'd made, but he reasoned that if he could just reach a human city, they would surely take in a small child. He just needed an opportunity to slip away. He had scanned the faces at the table, wondering if he could get one of them to trust him, anyone other than the hostile dragoon and the prickly elf. Then, with a sharp gasp from Riesling, it was decided. Her hand held the plant with the long, dangling root. She had lost. Jean saw the result of that lottery in Riesling's stormy expression. She had been ordered by the priest to perform the task. She felt it was an awful day, and Jean silently agreed with her. At the meeting, an elf had questioned the priest, asking if he truly intended for an elf to be soiled by a human's filth. The priest had simply confirmed it and left the matter to Riesling. She had tried to pass the duty on. She'd asked for volunteers, but the priest had claimed to have better things to do. She turned to the others, but they were already gone. When she pleaded with Balder, he had merely grunted and gestured to the arrow wound in his side as his excuse. The final insult came from the Dogman chieftain, who gave her a cheerful thumbs up and wished her luck, which only deepened her foul mood. Jean knew that the Dogman's casual encouragement would only make her treat him worse. And so there they were. As Jean looked around the drafty bathhouse, his mind raced, trying to find a chance to run. Riesling's voice cut through his thoughts. She remarked that elves had to put up with whatever was left over. Suddenly, she lunged forward, grabbing his arm and trying to pull off his shirt. She snapped at him to stop squirming and hurry up, reminding him that they were both girls. Jean shrieked in protest, yelling back that was precisely why it was impossible. He was a man in his 30s, and his mind couldn't handle the situation. Fed up, Riesling declared that if he wouldn't strip, he could just get in as he was. Before he could protest further, she lifted his small body and threw him, clothes and all, into the 40-degree water with a massive splash. Sometime later, Jean knelt on the floor, soaking wet and utterly defeated. He had never felt so powerless in his 32 years of life. Riesling, now dressed in a simple tunic, was drying her own hair with a towel. She tossed another one at him and told him to dry himself. As he held the towel to his face, he looked at her thoughtfully. He was surprised by her actions. He called out to her, cautiously shortening her name to Reese, and asked a question based on his own game's lore. He pointed out that as the elf chief, she normally wouldn't perform such a task herself. In his design, elves were prideful scholars, physically weak, who left manual labor to other races. Riesling corrected him sharply, telling him not to give her strange nicknames. Her name was Riesling. Jean apologized, explaining that her name was hard to say. As he spoke, a glowing rune for fire suddenly flared to life between them. Jean panicked, thinking he had said the wrong thing and was about to be burned to a crisp. He apologized profusely, promising to call her Riesling from then on. But the fire rune was joined by another for weakening, and then a powerful wind rune swirled into existence. Riesling stood behind him and used the combined magic to dry his hair, the warm, gentle breeze far more comfortable than he expected. It was essentially a magical hairdryer. Riesling explained that it was precisely because she was the chieftain that she had to do it. She could not let her people dirty their hands. As she worked, she decided to tidy up his hair as well, pulling out a pair of scissors. Her hands paused. She thought about what she was even doing. For 10 years, ever since that terrible day, she had honed her skills with a bow in magic for the sole purpose of getting revenge on humans. And yet here she was, grooming a human child like a servant. After a few snips, she announced that she was done for now. Jean, however, complained that she needed to do it properly. The elf chieftain froze, her eyes wide with shock. He turned around to face her, his freshly trimmed hair framing a small, innocent face with sparkling eyes. He asked if it was over now. Riesling took a step back, her hand flying to her mouth. She had almost said it. She had almost called him cute. Jean asked her what she meant by, "see you," but she was too stunned to answer. She was the dignified elven chief, respected by her people for her strength and resolve. But she had a secret she kept hidden from everyone. She loved cute things. Her room held a hidden collection of dolls and tea sets, some even purchased from a human village long ago. She tried to deny it, shaking her head. There was no way she could think a human was cute. But then Jean looked up at her again from his seat, his head tilted in confusion. That innocent, upward glance was too much. He looked up at her, asking what had just happened to her and why. Seeing her distress, Jean cautiously approached from behind. He reached a hand toward her, hesitantly asking if she was okay. Riesling flinched as if burned, whirling around to face him. She screamed at him to get away from her. She hated humans, she yelled, demanding to know why he wasn't more afraid. Jean paused, considering her words. Then, quietly, he explained that it was because she seemed like a good person. He told her he thought she had been really gentle with the fire magic she used to dry his hair. If she had wanted to, she could have made it much hotter to dry it faster. He touched the side of his head, remembering how she had even cut his hair carefully without snipping his ears. His mind flashed back to a time in his old life, at a barbershop, where the barber had gotten too close with a hairdryer, making him yelp from the heat. The care Riesling had shown was a stark contrast. He looked at her, a small, embarrassed smile on his face. He confessed that he was really happy when he noticed her being so careful, and he liked it. He apologized, admitting that ever since he had arrived in this world, it had been awful, with everyone staring daggers at him. Riesling just looked at him, completely thrown. A strange thought surfaced in Jin's mind. Now that he was looking at her properly, she reminded him a little of a character he had created for his game, a heroic knight named Guy. Riesling's face turned bright red. She seemed to think they looked a little similar too. Waving her arms in a flustered panic, she told him not to misunderstand. She insisted that she had only been gentle because she always did her jobs carefully. It was just what was expected of her as the chieftain. Jin watched her frantic denial and thought she was acting like a total shy girl. Her own words seemed to trigger something within her. A memory, sharp and painful, pierced through her thoughts. A cloaked figure, her father, walking away. She remembered him wishing her good luck. She saw herself as a little girl, standing tall and promising that she would look after the elven people for him. She remembered her younger brother shouting for their father to come back, while a small, winged girl hid her face in tears. Her hand clenched into a fist, gripping her tunic tightly. Her father's final words echoed in her memory, a warning that from now on, she should not get used to kindness. The memory reignited her anger. She hated humans. She turned on Jin, her face a mask of cold resolve. She told him he was tidy enough now for the priest to be happy. With her work there done, she should get out. Opening the creaky wooden door, she ordered him to leave, stating that if possible, she didn't want to get involved with him any more than she already had. But even as she said it, a part of her wondered why. Why did she hate humans this much? As Jin walked toward the door, he wondered the same thing. Riesling seemed to have a really hot temper about it. Lost in thought, her foot caught on the threshold of the doorway. He let out a gasp as Riesling stumbled forward, tipping out of the hut and down the stone steps. Jin saw her turn and his own panic flared. He yelled, pointing at her hand. It was the scissors. He then noticed that she was still holding one of the sharp blades, point up, right in her path. Riesling looked down at her own hand in alarm, realizing she still had the blade. Suddenly, Jin screamed for everything to stop. And just like that it did. The world went silent and still. Riesling was suspended in midair, halfway through her fall. He wondered if time had stopped. He saw a butterfly, hovering motionless in the air, confirming his impossible thought. He had no idea what was going on, but his instincts screamed at him. He hurriedly went down the steps and took the scissors from her hand. But how was this happening? He suddenly recalled the same strange feeling when he was running from the dogmen in the forest. He had been confused then and hadn't thought much of it, but it had definitely happened. This time felt different, though, as his head swam with dizziness, the world lurched back into motion. Riesling let out a startled cry as she crashed to the ground, momentum carrying her forward. She braced herself with one hand, shutting her eyes tight and screaming as she tumbled. When she looked up, she shouted in confusion. She looked around frantically, then her eyes widened. Below her, at the bottom of the stairs, lay Jin. She yelled down, asking how he got there when he had been right at the top of stairs a moment ago. Jin looked up at her, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. He had messed up. He realized that the frozen moment would have been the perfect chance to escape. But then he looked at the bewildered elf, who had been about to fall herself. No, he couldn't have just left her like that. Riesling, seeing him on the ground, scrambled to her feet. Her anger was gone, replaced by genuine concern. She rushed down to him, asking if he was okay and if he could breathe. Jin looked up at her worried face and smiled softly. Just as he thought, she was a good person after all. Riesling, seeing his goofy grin, knelt and started shaking him. A calm voice interrupted them. It was the horned priest. He looked down at the disheveled pair, asking what they were doing. Riesling scrambled to her feet, explaining that the cleansing was finished. In the background, Jin grumbled as he wiped the new layer of dirt from his hands. Riesling told the priest that she was just about to prepare a bed for the human. The priest nodded. He said there was also the matter of a change of clothes. He remarked that the rags Jin wore were too small and in a horrible state. He had managed to get some proper clothing from the gnomes and the dogmen. A moment later, Jin stood before them in a new outfit. A smart tunic, shorts, sturdy boots, and a dark capelet that rustled as he moved. Riesling let out a soft gasp. Jin looked over at her and saw her blushing furiously, muttering to herself about how he was so freaking cute. Jin, for his part, was just thankful it wasn't a frilly skirt or something. After all, he was a 32-year-old man on the inside. Riesling cleared her throat, trying to regain her composure. She called out to the human, then corrected herself, using his name, Toru. She admitted it was an annoying name. She said she didn't know what had just happened on the stairs, but it seemed like he had saved her. She explained that elves value gratitude. Therefore, he could call her Reese if her full name was too hard to say. Jin's face lit up with a huge, beaming smile that seemed to sparkle. He happily agreed. The sheer force of his cheerful reply made Riesling stumble back, clutching her chest and panting as if she'd run a mile. The priest looked at her with a question mark practically floating over his head. Jin, meanwhile, was inspecting his new cape. He asked if it came with a hood, figuring it would be useful in bad weather. He pulled it up over his head. The hood, designed for a child with ears on top of their head, had two pointed, cat-like ears that stood up perfectly. That was the last straw for Riesling. With a choked gasp, she collapsed to the ground. Jin looked back at her, then to the priest. A memory of her staggering away with a nosebleed flashed in his mind. He asked the priest if it was okay to leave her like that. The priest simply replied that he was sure she would live. As they walked away from the elven village and into the forest, Jin felt a sense of unease. He had just been going along with everything, but he didn't recognize the horned priest at all. He decided it would be best not to get too involved with him. After a short walk, they arrived at a rustic two-story wooden house nestled among the trees. The priest announced that this was where Jin would be living for the time being. Jin managed a nervous smile. He was glad it wasn't a pig pen, but he asked if the place was a vacant house. The priest looked down at him and stated plainly that it was his house. Jin's eyes went wide with shock. His jaw dropped. He was going to be living here? With him? A memory, sharp and stressful, pierced through the quiet of the morning. It was his old life. Jin Toru, a man with black hair and glasses, sat hunched over, slurping instant noodles. A voice from off-screen suddenly shouted, calling his name and yelling that the planner's document was a complete mess. The scene shifted to a chaotic office. A coworker shook Jin by the shoulders, screaming in his ear. He complained that they had been waiting all day for the setting table and if they had to start now, he wouldn't have time for something called ARFT. He desperately demanded Jin's password. The coworker peered at the computer screen with a worried look, wondering if any of it was even working as he prayed for the best while clicking on a specifications document. Jin watched his own hand rapidly scroll through a massive spreadsheet, the data a meaningless blur. With a sudden jolt, Jin sat bolt upright in bed, his eyes wide with horror. He shouted out a garbled phrase from his nightmare, something about Sukasuka's specifications. He was panting, his heart pounding in his small chest. He looked around the simple wooden room, at the plain bed and the small doll-like creature sitting near his feet. He realized with a sigh that it had just been a dream. A nightmare, really. He put a hand to his head, a weary smile on his face. It was strange to dream of something from his past life that had happened 10 years ago. It was around the time he had moved into his old apartment. His train of thought crashed to a halt. He looked up at the wooden plank ceiling, his smile vanishing. With a gasp, he suddenly yelled out, frantically wondering where he was. After a moment, he stood up and walked to the doorway, his new cape rustling around his small shoulders. He remembered now. He had died and been reincarnated into another world. He sighed, remembering the final, frustrating detail. He had been reborn as a little girl. He stood there, a hand on his chin, trying to piece together the last few hours. Why had he been sleeping here, anyway? A memory surfaced of the two-story house nestled in the trees, of the horned priest turning to face him. He recalled his own shocked question, asking the priest if he was really going to be living in his house. The priest had simply said that he was. Inside the cozy home, the priest, Cernan, had calmly explained the layout. He pointed out where the kitchen supplies were, where spare clothes were kept in the attic, and gestured to the room behind one of the doors as his. Jin remembered feeling completely overwhelmed. It was a surprisingly nice house, but that wasn't the problem. He had mumbled a flustered apology for intruding. His memory sharpened. He had regained some of his composure and tried to question the priest, pointing a finger and asking why he was suddenly going to such lengths for him. He told Cernan he had a ton of questions. But before he could even ask them, Cernan had cut him off. He said it was not yet time, that it was still too early for him. The priest's voice had been heavy with meaning as he insisted that before anything else, Jin needed to know more about this world. Jin had felt a wave of dizziness then, his thoughts swimming. What was Cernan saying he needed to know? His tone of voice was the same as before. Jin's mind screamed that he already knew this world better than anyone else. And then, everything had gone dark. He had collapsed right there on the wooden floor. Back in the present, standing in the bedroom, Jin's face burned with embarrassment. He guessed he must have been exhausted from running all over the place the night before. But he couldn't believe he had just passed out on the floor like that. That must have been when the priest carried him to this bed. He thought about Cernan. Maybe he wasn't a bad guy after all, even if he looked shady as hell. Jean squared his small shoulders with new resolve. He decided he needed to calm down and have a proper talk with him now. But it seemed that he had left him a letter, telling him that he needed to go away for a while. He had instructed Jean to go ask the various tribes if he needed food or anything else. Then he had added, with unsettling calmness, that since he had told them Jean was an important sacrifice, he probably wouldn't get killed. Jean stared blankly for a second, then shouted his outrage to the empty house. Cernan was kidding him. He had just been left here all alone. A little while later, Jean was trudging down a forest path, feeling completely dejected. He thought to himself that people really needed to be kinder to children. Of course, it was easy to be nice to kids when you lived in peaceful times. He supposed there were plenty of times in history when kids couldn't even go to school. He remembered the feeling of a small hand holding an adult's finger. Whatever. As a child without any real parents, he knew he had to face his problems like an adult. He stopped, holding up a piece of paper he'd found. A new determination lit up his face. To achieve his major goal of escaping from this place, he first needed to secure a route out. As a former corporate worker, he knew that scheduling and setting goals were essential. He found some charcoal in the house and sat in the grass, spreading the paper out. He began to draw a rough map of the area from what he could remember. He sketched out the priest's house, the elven village they had just left, and the meeting place where he had first seen Cernan. In the distance, he drew a tall, dark tower. He wondered if the different races lived in separate colonies, since he hadn't seen anyone but elves in Riesling's village. His eyes kept drifting to the tower on his map. He recognized it. That was the final dungeon of Rune Fantasia. It was designed to be seen from anywhere in the game, but the roads were all set up to make you go the long way around it. As he looked up from his drawing, his gaze fell upon a path leading into a dense section of woods he hadn't noticed before. His eyes widened in realization. Could this forest be an unexplored part of the map? He followed the path, and soon found himself peeking nervously from behind a large wooden water wheel. Before him lay a rustic village bustling with life. It was a dogmen village. Just as he thought, the villages were separated by race. The architecture was completely different from the elves' homes. He watched, fascinated. Two dogmen children were playing, one chasing the other with a stick. One of the child threw something, and it hit the tree beside him. He saw people using strange, rune-powered items to do their household chores. Until now, he had been too scared to properly see what was going on around him. But now, watching them, he couldn't help but be captivated. It really was the world of the game he had made. This was nothing like the reality he was used to. A powerful feeling washed over him. His eyes grew wide and sparkled with awe, a blush spreading across his cheeks. He realized that this was actually amazing. To enter the very world you created, wasn't that a dream come true for any creator, for any person? After all, Rune Fantasia was the first game he ever made all by himself. He grinned, a fist held up in a small gesture of triumph. He knew all the settings really well. That hellish project had been left to him, an outsider, but now, maybe he should be thankful for it? He looked out at the village again, a soft expression on his face. It was a happy thing, seeing the people of the world he created going about their daily lives. In a way, all of them were kind of like his children. A heartwarming, peaceful feeling settled over him. Then, shattering the quiet moment, someone shouted at the top of their lungs, yelling at someone that they just didn't get it at all. From his hiding spot behind the bushes, Jin's eyes widened in shock. A familiar figure stood in the center of the kobold village, Riesling, the elven chief. She was shouting at a tall, imposing kobold who stood with his back to her, his arms clasped behind him. Jin couldn't believe it. He wondered what the elven chief was doing in a kobold village, and worried that a fight was about to break out. Riesling's voice was sharp with anger. She demanded to know what was happening, yelling that the kobold of all people should understand the danger they were in. She insisted that the movement of monsters had been strange lately. Jin recognized the kobold she was yelling at. He remembered seeing him at the meeting of the chieftains, standing silently behind the main kobold leader like a shadow. He must be the chief's aide. The aide finally turned, his expression stern. He asked how many times he had to tell her, stating firmly that they could not agree to her request. Riesling pointed an accusing finger, her face flushed with fury. She told him that this time, a Hydra and an Orthrus had tried to enter her village. She demanded to know if he couldn't see why they needed to be vigilant about the future. She argued that even she had to take the next steps, or else things would get worse. Jean just stared, a little unimpressed by the bickering. But the names of the monsters sent a chill down his spine. Hydra? Orthrus? His mind reeled. He remembered them as very high-level monsters that appeared near the end of the game. He couldn't believe something like that had shown up near the village. He wondered what in the world was going on with this forest. Riesling pleaded with the aide to listen. She explained that of the three main races in the area, the gnomes, the elves, and the kobolds, the gnomes were not suited for battle. That was why their two races working together was so important. The kobolds were strong in close-range combat, and the elves were skilled with bows for long-range support. She demanded to know what possible reason he could have for refusing her proposal. The aide replied that the reason was simple. He explained that the kobold clan was a completely unified society. Their unity was their strength. They thought and fought as one. He feared that if they tried to fight alongside another race, they would only end up tripping over their own feet. Riesling threw her hands up in exasperation, retorting that he couldn't possibly know that for sure if he wouldn't even try. She muttered to herself that he was so damn hard-headed. Watching from the bushes, Jean sighed. He thought to himself that this wasn't going anywhere. The two of them just didn't seem very compatible. Lost in thought, he shifted his weight and accidentally rustled the leaves around him. The sound, though quiet, was enough. The aide's head whipped around toward the noise. He bellowed, demanding to know who was there. The shout was more than just a sound. It was a wave of force. Jean felt it hit him, his body freezing up. He recognized it instantly as the kobold's racial skill, roar. His mind supplied the details from his old design documents. It could stun enemies for a short time. His ears rang and his limbs refused to obey his frantic commands to move. The aide grumbled that he thought it was just one of their kids playing a prank, but then his eyes narrowed on the rustling bush. Before Jean could force his body to respond, a strong hand shot out, grabbed him by the cape, and lifted him effortlessly into the air. The aide stared, surprised to be holding a living human. From across the clearing, Riesling gasped, calling out Jin's name. Jean squirmed, yelling for the aide to wait, and managed a weak, trembling greeting to the elven chief. Riesling could only stare back, shaking. The aide held Jean up to his face, his voice a low growl as he demanded to know what he really was. Jean was utterly terrified. Riesling tried to step in, suggesting that if they had a calm discussion with the kobold chief, they could work things out. But Jean, with his eyes squeezed shut, spoke from a place deep inside, from the weary perspective of his 30-something-year-old soul. He told them he was just thinking that everyone should be more respectful of each other. He admitted that, honestly, seeing the two of them so confused and fighting, it felt like watching his own kids fight. Both the aide and Riesling stared at him, completely bewildered. The aide wondered aloud what on earth this brat was going on about. Looking tense, he dismissed the conversation, stating that the chief was out on patrol and they needed to stay vigilant. Then, without warning, he shoved Jean, sending her tumbling into a nearby bush. At that exact moment, a different roar tore through the forest. It was deeper, louder, and filled with a terrifying power that shook the very trees. The force of it washed over Jean again. The aide looked up, his face filled with alarm as he recognized the sound. Everyone snapped their heads toward the source of the noise. A white-furred kobold burst into the clearing. He roared orders with frantic urgency, telling everyone to get back. He commanded them to evacuate the women and children, and for anyone who could fight to grab spears. Then the reason for his panic crashed through the trees. A massive, horrifying beast with the body of a lion, bat-like wings, and a scorpion's tail. A manticore. The kobold warriors scattered in terror. Jin's blood ran cold. A manticore? He remembered it well, a mid-level boss with high resistance to debuffs that appeared much later in the game. He couldn't understand why something like that was here. The kobold chieftain stood his ground and unleashed a powerful roar of his own at the monster. Jean knew instantly that it was a waste of effort. The manticore had a special setting he himself had designed. As the chieftain's roar slammed into the beast, it barely flinched. It had 100% resistance to stuns. This was bad. Seeing the raw power of one of his creations in real life was more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. Just then, Riesling knocked an arrow to her bow. The tip crackled with blue energy, a thunder rune. Jin's mind raced. Thunder magic was a good choice against most monsters, but his memory flashed to a design document, to a chart showing the manticore's high elemental resistances. He shouted desperately to Riesling that it was no use. He yelled for her not to shoot at its body, but to aim for the ground in front of it. Shocked by the strange command, Riesling hesitated for only a second before adjusting her aim. The thunder arrow struck the earth, erupting in a massive explosion of electrical energy. The manticore was caught in the blast, rearing back with a pained shriek as lightning coursed over its body. It slammed its paw down, claws digging into the dirt as it tried to regain its balance. Then, it turned and fled, crashing back into the dense woods. The kobold warriors stared in stunned silence. One of them wondered aloud if it had really run away. The chieftain barked an order, telling them not to just stand there, but to go after it. Riesling let out a long sigh of relief, turning to Jean, who was now sitting on the ground. She told him that they were saved. Jean looked up at her, his small face grim. He wondered how many people would die this time. His question caught her off guard. She explained the grim situation, how facing a large monster like a manticore always resulted in many elves and kobolds losing their lives. But if they let it go, it was smart enough to just come back and attack the village again. She spoke of her frustration, how she had tried to propose they join forces many times, but they never accepted her help. He knew all about the mistrust between the races. And he wondered why it had come to this. In the world he remembered, the story ended with all the races laughing together as friends. Everyone was happy. His thoughts were interrupted as the kobold chieftain and his aide approached him. They wanted to recruit his eyes for the hunt, to help them track the monster. Riesling was shocked they would ask a child. But Jean stood up, a new conviction in his voice. He told them this wasn't about justice for him. He declared that he knew how to defeat the manticore safely, and he didn't want to let them die. The kobolds stared down at him, surprised by his confidence. He begged them to listen, assuring them that it would be okay. His mind was already scrolling through the manticore's attack patterns and weaknesses from his old design notes. He stepped in front of a stunned Riesling, holding onto her arm as if to protect her. He looked the chieftain dead in the eye and made a bold declaration. He was the man who knew the most about this world. He pleaded with them to let him and Riesling join the hunt. The heavy silence that followed Jin's declaration was broken only by the crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. The hunting party moved through a path of pure destruction. Great trees were snapped like twigs, the raw splinters a testament to the manticore's raw power as it had fled. The kobold chieftain remarked that he had never seen a beast so easy to track. His aide, Gray, agreed, wondering aloud at the incredible strength required to simply toss trees aside without a care. Gray glanced back over his shoulder, his expression sour. He demanded to know what the elf and the human had done to make the manticore so enraged. Gray looked down at Jean, who trailed beside him, and noted that for all the kobolds complaining, he didn't seem to be hesitating. Jean gave a strained smile and held up his hands, which were bound tightly with rope. With a small, hopeful voice, he asked if someone could please untie him. Gray's response was a flat denial. He grumbled that doing so would only lead to bad news. Jean shouted in frustration but quickly resigned himself to his situation, muttering that he supposed it couldn't be helped. Riesling, who held the other end of the rope, looked back at him. She told him she was lucky the stubborn kobold had even permitted her to join the hunt at all, and that he could entrust the rope to her. She admitted that she didn't entirely believe everything he said, but after what happened earlier, she couldn't completely ignore his words either. With tears welling in his eyes, Jean begged her to listen to him then. Riesling gently patted his head, telling him not to cry and that she didn't mind letting him take the lead for a little bit. Then she brought her hand down in a light chop on his head and asked why the manticore had recoiled from an arrow that didn't even hit it. Jean yelped in pain and tried to explain, but was interrupted by one of the other kobold warriors. The warrior told them that Gray, the vice chief, was always mistrustful of others. Suddenly, Gray threw up a hand, bringing the entire group to a dead stop. A shrill tension filled the air as he announced that something was approaching, and not from the path ahead. The kobold chieftain roared a command for everyone to get ready, shouting that the attack was coming from the side. Chaos erupted. A shadowy, winged shape burst from the trees with a deafening roar. One kobold warrior was sent flying backward through the air, his sword tumbling from his grasp. Another grunted in pain as he was struck. Gray cursed under his breath as the chieftain himself was hit, sent sprawling as his weapon was knocked away. The warriors cried out in alarm, one clutching a wounded shoulder while another yelled for Gray and the chieftain. The remaining kobolds scrambled to protect their injured leader. The chief apologized, saying that he couldn't provide much help on his own and that they would have to hold out for reinforcements. Gray acknowledged that he understood. Suddenly the massive, shadowy monster, its white eyes glowing in the gloom, He admitted that they were in trouble. The other kobolds, seeing their leaders injured and outmatched, shouted their names in panic. Jean looked up with a determined expression. He knew what that was. Suddenly, a scene shifted to a glass vial tipping over in front of a monster. Anne Gray says that they had some cool items with them. A heavy thud shook the ground as the manticore slammed its paw down, confused. A moment later, the kobold chieftain held up a small, open bottle. A thick mist poured out, enveloping the party. The chieftain announced the item's name, Vanish Mist. Gray explained that it was a very valuable item, since the resources to make it had run out. Jean asked if it made them temporarily transparent. Nearby, an injured kobold groaned that he couldn't even turn his torso. Jean trembled with excitement, exclaiming that of course such an item existed. Riesling looked down at him with a deadpan expression, asking why he was so overjoyed. A thought entered Jin's mind, like a text box from his old game. The Vanish Mist would make physical attacks ineffective for 3 turns. Gray warned everyone that while the mist concealed them, a big move could still get them noticed. The chieftain, his voice grim, declared that they would kill the beast right here. Gray clenched his wounded fist, stating that retreat was never an option. Jean felt the morale of the group rise. He inwardly urged them to listen to him. Suddenly, he shouted at Gray that the manticore was weak against light. Gray turned, surprised by the declaration. Jin's mind was thrown back to his old life, to a cluttered office where he argued with a coworker. He remembered his coworker complaining that the manticore was way too strong for the game, that kids wouldn't be able to clear it if debuffs didn't work. He had broken the game's balance. Jean remembered sighing and agreeing to make a change. He explained to the kobolds now that there was a proper strategy. Manticores usually lived deep in the forest and rarely saw sunlight. Because of that, a strong flash of light would freeze them for a short time. He realized that the first thunder arrow hadn't been strong enough to stop it completely, but a stronger blast of lightning magic should have done the trick. Gray stared down at the boy with an unimpressed expression, then a slight smirk crossed his face. Gray glanced over his shoulder as he pulled a flustered and annoyed Jean forward, while shouting that he had brought someone who could help. The kobold chieftain leaned in close, his face inches from Jin's. He asked him, his voice low and intense, if he was really a regular human. Jean gave a nervous smile. The chieftain continued, his expression full of suspicion. He found the boy's story curious, explaining that while they had heard tales of the rare manticore, they had never actually seen one before. Jean nervously clenched the fabric of his cape. He then asked why he knew so much about such a monster's way of life. Riesling then addressed the kobolds, suggesting they deal with that particular case another time. She pointed out they were scaring a small, tied-up kid who couldn't do anything. Gray agreed that they could discuss it later if time permitted. But he added that while the manticore's reaction to light might be real, there was a chance they could just trigger it into becoming even more savage. He then spoke to Riesling in a low voice, telling her the kid was suspicious and might have been sent to destroy them by spreading false information. He ordered her to keep an eye on him while they fought. Jean overheard every word. The boy's heart sank. He turned to Riesling, pleading for her to do something, but she shook her head. She told him it was no use. She had been warned not to do anything but watch him. He urged her to accept his plan, promising there wouldn't be any danger, admitting he didn't trust his own strength at the moment. Riesling thought to herself that something was definitely strange. Jean looked down, dejected, wondering if she was also suspicious of him. Riesling looked at him, her expression softening. She told him that even if it didn't seem like it, she felt that he had risked his life to protect her. She said he didn't seem like a bad person. Then, flustered, she covered her mouth and quickly added that it was just because he looked human. She stammered that she would be sad if he died. Jean was stunned by her sudden confession. He looked from her to the kobolds, a new resolve hardening his face. He stated that he only had one life, and the same applied to them. If anyone died, Riesling would be sad. Before she could process his words, he snapped the rope binding his hands. With a sudden burst of speed, he dashed forward, kicking up dirt as he ran directly toward the manticore. The beast saw the small figure approaching and leaped into the air, its claws extended. Jean shouted over his shoulder, yelling for Riesling to shoot right in front of his eyes. From inside the manticore's massive, open maw, he looked like a tiny meal. He finished his command, yelling that if she didn't, he would die. Riesling screamed in a mixture of fury and panic, pulling back her bowstring. She unleashed an arrow infused with magnified lightning magic, calling Jean a moron as the bolt flew. Jean saw the incredible power she had released and thought with horror that she had overdone it. A massive explosion of light and energy erupted, so powerful it sent Jean flying backward. The manticore was caught in the center of the blast, its body contorting in pain as electricity crackled over its form. It let out a pained gasp, its eyes slamming shut as the world went white. With the monster blinded and stunned, Gray charged. Gray's sword sliced across the beast's side and thrust his blade deep into its body. As the light faded, a tall figure stood over Jin's collapsed form. It was Gray. He looked down at the scene, wondering if this had all been the child's idea. He saw how the boy had used himself as bait to force the good-natured elf to act, and how his strange words had come true. He wondered what in the world this child was. Jean, trembling with relief, looked up with a wide, happy smile. He was so glad it had gone well, just like he said it would. The chieftain exclaimed that they had done it, but then immediately scolded Jean for his foolishly relaxed expression. He pointed a finger at the boy, telling him he wasn't so young that he couldn't imagine what would have happened if he'd been caught in the manticore's claws. He admitted that if Riesling hadn't acted, he wouldn't have been able to jump in and save him. Gray snarled, calling Jean a revolting bastard. Jin's feelings were surprisingly hurt. He'd never been told that to his face before in his entire life. Gray pointed his sword at the boy, accusing him of betraying their trust and pretending to be a supreme ruler by using the powers of others. The Gray then walked away supporting the groaning kobold chieftain. He told Gray that even among humans, this one was strange. He then looked at Jean and thanked him, explaining that the clan would have been devastated if their chief had died. Just then, Riesling grabbed Jean, shaking him by the cheeks and asking frantically if he had used her. She babbled that she had been glared at for interacting with other races. Jean could only make nonsense sounds as she shook him. Then, her frantic energy faded, and she pulled him into a tight hug, her bow clattering to the ground beside them. She whispered that she couldn't believe a kid had done something like this. She gently patted his head. Jean looked up at her, a quiet understanding on his face. He told her that he was starting to get it. They weren't bad people. A pained look crossed Riesling's face, and she finished his thought for him. They only just hated humans. A dark memory surfaced, of a cloaked figure walking away from the burning bodies of fallen demi-humans. Jean then asked if she wanted to save the gods. Riesling looked at him, her expression hardening with resolve as she remembered her duty. That was why, she said, she had decided to sacrifice him. The words triggered a memory in Jean, of a messy office and a looming deadline. He saw his old self and his coworker celebrating, shouting that their game was finally done and ready to be released to the world. The memory filled him with a powerful conviction. He looked at Riesling and gave a thumbs up. He declared that if that was the case, then he was going to save all of them. Then he paused, admitting that he didn't actually know if he could. Riesling just stared at him, a deadpan look on her face as she considered his words. The scene changes, and we see a massive, strangely marked fish leaped from the water next to a submerged stone structure. Far away, in a magnificent circular hall, the priest stood on a stone dais surrounded by water. A single beam of light shone down on him. He stood before a large, round mirror, staring at the reflection. He spoke to the image with a mixture of awe and contempt, accusing him of the arrogance of a god. He called him by a new name, God Toru. The mirror's reflection shifted. It now showed Riesling, kneeling on the forest floor and placing a hand on Jin's forehead to check for a fever. Jean protested, flustered. The priest's voice echoed from an unseen place, urging them to hurry. His voice turned grim, delivering a final, dire warning. If they did not, the common people would all perish. A memory surfaced, unbidden. Jean stood in the doorway of a traditional room in his old life, a young man in a suit holding a briefcase, hesitating on the threshold. He had known for a long time, he thought, why his father had said what he did back then. Inside, his father sat at a low table, his back to the door. Then the memory shifted, and his father was turning, a warm smile on his face. He had told Jean that even if you live a steady life, when you die, you die. He said it was good to live as you like because, after all, they were human. A voice called his name, pulling him from the past. He was standing in a daze inside a rustic wooden room. Riesling called his name again, her voice sharp with concern. She appeared beside him, holding a cup, and asked if he was all right. Before he could fully answer, she shoved him down into a wooden chair, telling him to take a seat. He apologized, assuring her it was nothing. But he couldn't help but wonder why that old memory had come back just now. As he suspected, it felt like his life was flashing before his eyes. His suspicion was confirmed a moment later. Riesling stood before the table with a menacingly wide smile, wearing an apron and oven mitts as she held a steaming pot aloft. On the table before them was a mountain of food, including a prominently displayed, thoroughly cooked fish with strange, feathered fins. As they sat down, Riesling suddenly looked shocked, turning her head as she exclaimed aloud. She asked if the priest had really vanished. She seemed flustered by the news but quickly composed herself, placing her hands on her hips. She supposed it couldn't be helped, but she could at least prepare a meal for him. Jean told her she didn't have to go to so much trouble, though he quietly urged her not to hold back. Riesling insisted, saying she couldn't just leave a child alone. Jean deadpanned internally, thinking that she really was the kind of character who was terrible at cooking. She explained that the priest, Cernan, was always like this. He would be gone in a flash and back before you knew it, and nobody ever knew where he was going. Jean asked if that meant she and the others didn't know him well either. Riesling admitted she didn't, but she respected him deeply because she was in his debt. She thought to herself that Jean should just eat and tried to stay cool. As she began to eat, Jean got up from the table, the small doll-like creature plopping onto his head as he walked away. Riesling looked over her shoulder, confused. He returned a moment later holding a basket filled with small, ornate bottles. He held it out, asking what she thought of the things that guy had bought. Riesling's eyes widened in shock. She couldn't believe it was Vanish Mist, and so much of it. She demanded to know how he got it. Jean asked if the items were really that valuable, adding that he thought there were only 2 or 3 left in existence. A quick memory showed him finding the basket tucked under the bed in his room. He had known then that a purpose had been found for it. Lying on the floor, he had read the note left on top. It simply asked if he knew how to use it. There was no mistaking it, he had realized. The priest wanted him to do something. Jean wondered just what, and how much, the priest knew. The priest's voice from before echoed in his mind, the memory of him saying that he had been waiting for 10 years. Back in the present, Jean stood behind Riesling with a new seriousness. He asked her to tell him, in detail, what had happened 10 years ago. He leaned forward, his eyes wide and pleading, begging her because he just wanted to know the reason. Riesling looked distressed, telling him to please stop. She lamented that the food was losing its taste. All she knew, she said, was that humans had oppressed the demi-humans with forbidden spells. Jin's mind connected the pieces. He asked if that was why he was being sacrificed, because of what happened 10 years ago. Riesling was stunned into silence. After a moment, she began to speak. She explained that after the king of the humans got his hands on forbidden magic made by the demon lord, he shared it with his subordinates. For example, she said, there were spells to control the weather. A peaceful gnome village in a basin had been turned into a lake overnight. There were also forbidden spells that created vast numbers of undead. Even the kobolds, masters of group warfare, were no match for soldiers that couldn't die. Her eyes grew sad as she remembered her own past. The elven village she used to live in had been a beautiful place, with clear water and endemic flowers blooming everywhere. But just one person had destroyed all of it, the Dragon Master. He came with a number of dragons that should have been disobedient to man and, in a single day, burned a great number of elves and all their land to ashes. Jean looked horrified. It was as if his game had re-emerged in reality. Riesling concluded that forbidden spells were simply too powerful. None of them were a match. They had nowhere to go, trapped in their own forest hometown. She then looked at him, noticing his shocked expression, and quietly said his name. His mind was racing. In Rune Fantasia, wherever the hero went, mini-bosses would awaken, causing all sorts of problems. Each of them carried one forbidden spell. The hero had to follow the road to the final dungeon while collecting them. A terrible realization dawned on him. If demi-humans were being tormented by forbidden spells, then the king of the humans, it was as if the demon lord had been revived. The thought was so jarring Riesling slapped him hard on both cheeks to snap him out of it. She looked at him, her expression serious and questioning. She asked why he cared so much. She reminded him of his promise to save them, but pointed out that he had no reason to go that far. It all happened 10 years ago, before he was even born. Her voice rose with frustration. She said there were probably plenty of other humans who could be sacrificed. She demanded to know why he was being so irrational, wanting to help demi-humans. Jean was taken aback by her sudden outburst. Then, squeezing her eyes shut, she stammered that it was still a mistake to have him be sacrificed. The image of his father's smiling face flashed in his mind. Jean looked at Riesling, his own expression softening into a gentle, knowing smile. He told her it was because parents wish their children happiness. He then added that he was responsible for them. A question mark seemed to appear over her head. He thought to himself that perhaps he should tell her, of all people, about his peculiar situation. The more allies he had to save the world, the better. He opened his mouth and started to speak, telling her that he. Suddenly, a deafening crash tore through the building. A stone wall shattered, exploding inward in a cloud of dust and debris. From the gaping hole, a cloud of dark, shadowy energy emerged, two glowing white eyes and a familiar rune symbol burning on its forehead. Both Jean and Riesling flinched, recognizing the mark. Before either could react, a sharp, bladed chain whipped from the darkness and wrapped tightly around Riesling, binding her arms to her torso. She cried out in pain and shock as Jean watched in horror. A cloaked figure with long, light hair appeared beside a large, dragon-like creature bearing the same rune. The figure declared it an easy victory, singing a little song about capturing the elven leader. The cloak fell back, revealing a man with spiky black hair and a cruel, condescending smirk. It was the Dragon Master. He held Riesling from behind, a bladed whip pressed to her neck, and mocked her for her naive beliefs about nature. Coughing from the dust, Jean stumbled out from behind a pile of rubble. He started to chastise the man for busting into people's houses. The Dragon Master looked over, surprised to see a human kid. Noticing the creature on Jin's head, he mistook it for gnome ears and asked if Jean was the gnome chief. Jean considered the question for a moment, then flatly said no. With a bored expression, the Dragon Master ordered him to die, and a massive, dark dragon lashed toward the boy. But Jean didn't flinch. He recognized the forbidden spell, obedience. The Dragon Master's whip swung for Jean, but was somehow deflected. He looked shocked, then swung again, the blade swishing past and hitting the ground. Jean calmly began to explain the spell. He identified it as the forbidden spell of obedience, an ability to manipulate any monster at will, with the number controlled depending on the magician's total power. Then he fixed his gaze on the man and asked if he was the Dragon Master that burnt down the elven village. The man glared, demanding to know who the hell he was and why he was being so specific. Jin's mind raced. He had to think of something. Slamming his hands down on a piece of rubble for emphasis, he declared that he was a forbidden spell researcher for the gnomes. He claimed that since they were a long-lived species, he knew things that others didn't. He offered a deal: spare him and he would reveal what he knew about forbidden spells, including their weaknesses. The Dragon Master grabbed the elf by the collar, his face inches away, and ordered him to spit it out. Jean gave a confident smirk. Before that, he said he had a question. He asked what the man was going to do with the elf. The Dragon Master looked back over his shoulder dismissively. He said he wasn't really planning to kill her. As Riesling struggled, he tapped his finger on her forehead. A glowing rune appeared. He told Jean not to waste his time. Riesling went limp, her eyes suddenly blank. Jean shouted in disbelief. The rune on her forehead glowed brightly. He yelled, demanding to know what he was doing. He told the Dragon Master that not even the Demon Lord manipulated people with spells. It was a disregard for their dignity. The Dragon Master turned, a crazed, wide-eyed grin spreading across his face. He asked what Jean meant by people. He proclaimed that the only things that could be called people in this world were humans. He pulled the compliant Riesling closer, sneering that demi-humans were just fake humans. He explained that he had recently received an order to eradicate any demi-human. By managing the chief, he could round up the entire clan, and the king's reward would be his. He quoted the king's words, that the world's extent was limited, and if you were to fight for a chair, it should only be the throne. There was no place for demi-humans in this world. The words triggered another memory for Jean. He was back in his old office, looking over design documents for the various demi-human races. He recalled the days and nights he had spent thinking about them, how they were first designed to quarrel, but would ultimately join forces with the hero to defeat the Demon Lord. It was just so sad. The Dragon Master's voice cut through his thoughts, demanding that he start talking about the weakness of the forbidden spell. He reminded Jean that he wanted to be spared, then added with a cruel laugh that he would kill him after he listened anyway. Jean looked up from the desolate ground. He told the man that there was no weakness. His expression was sad, yet firm. Forbidden spells, he explained, had no weaknesses. He knew this because he was the one who had set it up that way, to make them the strongest enemy. Oh, really? The Dragon Master scoffed, and his dark dragon lunged forward in a violent strike. The mind-controlled Riesling stood blankly, scanning. The Dragon Master clicked his tongue, calling it a waste of time and calling Jean a nonsense talker. He looked at the spot where Jean had been. He was confused. There were no traces of blood. He turned to his dragon, asking if it had swallowed the boy whole. A thought echoed, forbidden spells have no weaknesses. However, the thought continued, its wielder can still leave an opening. A transparent figure slammed a flying kick into the side of the Dragon Master's head. Jean held the empty vanish mist bottle, his form shimmering back into view. The man stumbled, shocked, recognizing the rare item. He realized Jean must have used it the moment the dragon struck. Jean explained to himself how he had clung to the dragon's head and used the height to land the kick. The Dragon Master laughed it off, shouting that a kick from someone like him was ineffective as he dashed forward. Then he stopped, his eye wide with shock. He panted, confused. In front of him was just a regular, small gnome, and yet what was this feeling? Jean stood with his head bowed. He agreed that he was right, that he was worthless with his powerlessness. Shameless and sad. He looked up, a sharp, almost demonic grin twisting his features. He spoke of the sensation of going against everything in the world. He met the Dragon Master's shocked gaze. But above all else he was pissed off. A memory of his past life surfaced. He had always thought of his father as a careless man. When he drank, his mind thought only of drinking. On Jin's rare days off, his father was always asleep amidst a pile of beer cans. Later he rarely came home at all. Jin's mind snapped back to the present, his thoughts filled with the regrets of his past. The Dragon Master's heart was pounding. Cold sweat beaded on his forehead as he panted, his chest tight. He tried to reassure himself. He still had a hostage. His dominance was assured. The kick had only happened once, catching him by surprise. But he couldn't shake the feeling. He couldn't understand why he was so scared of this small gnome walking toward him, a figure whose face was completely lost in shadow. Jean called out to him. He wanted to know why the man was doing this. He reminded him that the demon lord was dead and that they had already won their peaceful days. He said it was a time when they could forget about danger, a spring they should share with everyone in the world, including the demi-humans. The Dragon Master responded with a furious lash of his whip, the blade striking the ground in an explosive burst of force. He laughed, a harsh, grating sound. He mocked Jean for asking why. He screamed that peace was not enough. He declared that once you claim one thing, you always want more, and that was just how humans were. The dust settled, revealing Jean standing calmly, untouched. He acknowledged that the Dragon Master's attacks were physical, and that his invisibility mist wouldn't mean much. He promised to keep hitting the man until the mist's effects wore off. He would keep going, he vowed, until the man's head was blown off. For a moment, his anger softened into a sad contemplation. He remembered the ending of his game. At the celebration after the hero's triumphant return, everyone, humans and demi-humans alike, had come together, enjoying themselves side by side. He wondered if that was just how it looked on the surface. If it was, he thought, then the fault was his. He hadn't pictured them well enough. A memory that was not Jin's flickered in the Dragon Master's mind. He had been happy, back then, after the hero's return. He was walking down a palace corridor when a woman with short black hair had stopped him. She told him not to do it, reminding him that he had worked so hard to become a court-appointed bodyguard. He had brushed her off, saying he was just going to advise the king. He called it crazy for the king and his men to exterminate innocent demi-humans, and said someone had to stop it and walked away. Back in the present, the Dragon Master clutched his head, his face a mask of confusion. He didn't understand why he was remembering that now, why he had ever thought that destroying the demi-humans was wrong. He was terrified by the conflict in his own mind. A scream tore from his lips. He grabbed the blank-faced Riesling, blaming her for his confusion. Dark thoughts swirled around him, voices in his head screaming at him to kill and destroy. He held up a hand, a glowing rune on his weapon pulsing with energy. Chanting the name of the enchantment spell, bestowal, he cursed the laws of nature. The rune on Riesling's forehead flared to life, her hair erupting into a cascade of destructive flame. Jean watched, shielding his eyes from the blinding light. A small, knowing smile touched his lips. He called out to the Dragon Master, reminding him that murder would also show up on his balance sheet. The whip of pure energy slammed into the ground just short of its target, erupting in a violent explosion. The Dragon Master let out a wild, triumphant laugh, certain that the dumb gnome had gotten himself burned. He taunted the empty space, asking if Jean believed in miracles. He sneered that God had given up on the filthy demi-humans. As he spoke, a hand suddenly appeared from the smoke, pushing his face away with a soft thud. Jean stood before him, completely unharmed. The Dragon Master stared in shock. Jean met his gaze and asked him if God wasn't excellent. He then told him that while God might not be in this world, there was still a process. Jean asked if the man knew how the hero had collected the forbidden spells. Each of the Demon Lord's servants had a forbidden spell engraved in their bodies, and the hero had transferred those spells to his own body. He reached forward, chanting the incantation. Wisdom to the people, curse to the vessel. He grabbed the Dragon Master's hand, the one with the glowing rune. He told the man that his forbidden spell was right there. The Dragon Master screamed for him to stop, but it was too late. A glowing rune appeared on his own forehead as he felt his power being ripped away, slipping from his grasp as he stumbled backward. Another memory filled Jin's mind. He saw his father, passed out on the floor. He had never had anyone to call a mother. His family had never really been more than just his dad, a man who drove a truck for work and was rarely home. He remembered being alone, writing at a low table. He remembered his father looking over his aspiration questionnaire, where he had crossed out, game expert, and written, going to university. His father had known about his troubles, he realized. He had known and said nothing, perhaps because helping was an annoyance. Soon after, his father had died in an accident. If only he had known then, he would have said it with gratitude. Jean launched himself into the air. The Dragon Master, still falling, watched in disbelief as his forbidden spell was taken from him. Jean called out to the dragon. A massive black wing flapped, and Jean clung to it, using his newfound connection. The Dragon Master landed hard on the ground, disoriented. As he knelt, Jean recalled a memory of himself as Toru, writing at his desk. He had been mad only at himself, resolving to put his soul into his work, knowing he couldn't help others if he couldn't help himself. Jean landed softly in front of the kneeling man. He told the Dragon Master that he was trying to help the humans, too. The man stared, his mind reeling. He asked if Jean was human. He then spat on the ground, calling Jean a traitor. He disappeared in the form of a cloaked figure with a sudden whoosh. The floor dissolved into flowing sand. This, Jean thought with concern, was quite bad. Elsewhere, Riesling, now free from her curse, sighed in relief. Jean tried to get his attention, telling her to look over for a bit. He turned to face the Riesling's monstrous figure, its glowing eyes and pointed ears a terrifying sight, and stammered her name. A moment later, Riesling was back to normal, angrily scolding him. She told him she had enough of him using himself as a shield and begged him to stop, asking what she was supposed to do with the trauma of him dying. Jean knelt on the ground and formally apologized, promising to reflect on his actions. Riesling sighed, her anger fading. She admitted that it had been very close, and so hard to even move a finger of her own will. Jean smiled, saying that since she had said something like that, he had fought against it with all his might. Riesling thanked him, telling him they were saved because of his help. Jean admitted he had thought it was over too. He glanced at the Dragon Master's broken whip on the ground and asked what had happened to him, wondering if he had died. In a distant, grand hall, a woman with long, light hair cursed in frustration. The Dragon Master lay on the floor nearby, clenching his fist in a rage. He swore that he would murder the brat who took his forbidden curse. Riesling explained that the man had used the forbidden spell of separation of bodies, leaving behind a symbol on the ground. Jean was sure he would come again, and they would have to be ready. Just then, kobolds led by Grey rustled out of the bushes, asking if something had happened. They had heard the echoes deep in the forest. Suddenly, the villagers panicked as the dragon landed in the clearing. Jean remembered it with a start. Jean calmly told everyone it was all right, that he was keeping it from raging with a forbidden spell. The words sent them into a panic of their own. This had not gone as expected. The kobolds began to murmur amongst themselves, confused. Riesling turned to Jean, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. She asked him what he was. She said that no matter how she looked at it, he knew too much. She couldn't believe he was just a human child. It wasn't possible. Tears welled in Jin's eyes. He pleaded with her to believe him, insisting that he was not their enemy. Riesling's expression softened immediately. She told him that they knew that much. They knew he was serious about helping them. She had only asked for an explanation. She became flustered when she saw him wiping his eyes, asking if he was crying and if she had said something wrong. Jean shook his head, but his mind flashed to his father. He wished he had talked more earnestly with him back then. Taking a deep breath, he turned to face Riesling, Grey, and the other assembled demi-humans. He told them to listen, that he would explain everything. His mind wandered for a moment, thinking about how something was wrong with this world, how someone seemed to want to intervene. He thought of his past self, Toru, standing alone in a void, wondering if there was any meaning to his arrival. If so, he had decided he would just do what he could for their sake. He explained the sequence of events so far. As the world's creator, he told them his story. When he finished, he let out a sigh of relief and asked what they should do now. A hand grabbed his shoulder. Gray and Riesling were yelling at him, their faces a picture of utter disbelief. They didn't understand. They demanded he explain what a creator was, and what the game even was. Jean stood alone, feeling small and overwhelmed. He looked up at the sky, a weary resignation in his eyes. He wished, just for a bit longer, that they would be kinder to him.